Welcome to B&H's event space, and I also wanted to introduce you guys to Conceptual Self-Portraiture because it's one of my favorite things that I do. It's actually where my creativity finds the best outlet, so I hope that you will embrace it and give it a chance because it's one of the best things I've done with my photography and I really enjoy it. In fact, I give this lecture to our summer intensive students at RMSP, and that is a long program, and I just slam them with this inspiration in the middle of it, and a lot of them really enjoy it, so I hope that you'll get something out of it as well. So to start out with, I wanted to show you the work of some of the people who inspire me the most. And I'll start with a woman named Sarah Ann Loreth. She is a phenomenal self-portrait artist, and she really takes conceptual work to the next level by putting herself in the scene. David Talley is another one. He's great. He's actually teaching for us now, and he's a wonderful photographer, also a self-portrait. Alex Stoddard, he's really working his way up there. He's pretty famous now, so he's worth giving a Google because he's got quite the myriad of wonderful self-portraits. Whitney Justison, also, she's actually, I've had the pleasure of meeting her, and she's very sweet, and she takes beautiful self-portraits just like this. Cara Kobus, I hope I'm saying that right, also wonderful self-portraits. And the reason I want to show you guys this, another Grace Adams, is because these are all normal people just like us. You can do it too. And they just grab a camera, put themselves in front of it, find a place, and they take a picture. It's hard at first, but we're going to talk about how to work through those hurdles because I think that you can do it too. And one thing that I really encourage is it's hard to take a great self-portrait when you don't really feel that you're looking great that day. So what I like to do when I'm about to take a self-portrait is I really want to get myself in the mood that I feel like I can point a camera at myself, because even when other people are taking pictures of me, I don't feel like I really want them to be taking pictures of me every day. So you want to put yourself in the mindset. Say, I'm going to take a self-portrait. It might look great, it might look bad. You're going to have a lot of both. And you want to just accept that you might not have the best shots every day, or get yourself to a place, put on makeup, dress up, get to a place where you feel like you can take a great photo of yourself. That's what I would recommend, because self-portraiture is awesome, and I have some reasons why. It's the ultimate self-expression. In my opinion, putting yourself into the scene in your photograph is one of the most powerful ways that you can express yourself as a photographer. Because how often do we really include ourselves in our portraits? It's a very great way to learn more about yourself. It polishes your portraiture skills, so if you are a portrait photographer by profession, this is a great way to experiment more with how you can learn how light works without having to take up anyone else's time. It's just you, it's you and your camera. So it's a great way to polish your skills. It also can be done on your own time. No one else, just you. You can do it whenever you'd like, and it's a great way to just practice. In my opinion, the possibilities are absolutely endless with self-portraiture because the only boundary you have is your mind. So you want to just push yourself and find new ideas, and we'll talk about how we can get there. What I think is if you just learn more, you shoot more, you think about it more, and you experiment more, you're going to come up with something great. It just takes pushing yourself. So how do these people do it? These photos that I've shown you, they look pretty incredible, right? Like, I'm really impressed by these people. And I wanted to do it myself. So 6 years ago, I decided I was going to take a self-portrait. I just put my camera in front of me, and I knew it would work. So let's talk about what I've learned since then. Some steps to success for self-portraiture. And this is what we're going to base our lecture off of today. I want to introduce you guys to a few concepts that will help you if you're going to undertake this endeavor. The first is, like I mentioned, be comfortable with yourself. It's impossible to take a photo that you like of yourself unless you accept that you have to just be relaxed and ready and comfortable with yourself. Next, just start shooting. It can be the most daunting task on any given day. And so you want to make sure that you just buck up, do it. It's just like getting out there when you don't want to go take a portrait of someone else. You just do it anyway, and you never know, you might come up with the best picture of your life. So you want to just start shooting even if your brain is telling you every reason not to. And in my opinion, try everything. There are so many ideas that are floating around in your brain, and you might think, oh, I don't have the technical skills. I don't have the time to do that. I don't have the place. I don't have the optimism to pull off that idea. Don't let that stop you. That is fear, and that should never get in your way. Buy a remote at B&H. B&H is quite the selection, and I think that this is one of the most important parts of self-portraiture, because if you don't have a remote, you're constantly running back and forth to your tripod to push the shutter button, run, wait for the 10-second timer, and then stay. And then you have to go back, see if it looks okay, come back, take another one. It gets a little daunting, it gets a little stressful, really exhausting too. So buy yourself a remote. We'll talk more about that. And the next one is just get inspired. It's impossible to create this work without having some sort of creativity well that you can pull from. So you need some inspiration to start that. All self-portrait artists learn to regard the following things. The direction of light. This is very important because you're a portrait artist, but you're also dealing with yourself. So you learn a lot about which way to position your face, which way to sit in front of a light source so that you will look how you want to look. You'll learn a lot. It's great. You also will learn about facial expression. You'll learn what will work best in what situation, and you'll learn how you can apply that to other portraits as well, which is great. The angle of your face, this is not always the best bet, but you can experiment with everything, and the angle of your face is very important to consider when you're setting up your shot. The next is clothes and props. We'll talk a little bit about this, because props can sometimes be the source of your inspiration, so can clothes, and they can also detract from your image quite a lot. So we'll talk about how to best pick these options. The almighty tripod. Some of us hate tripods, some of us love them. If you're a landscape photographer, you're good to go. You already got one, probably with you right now. But if you're not, it's very important to invest in one because you obviously can't take a great self-portrait that's not at arm's length if you don't have your tripod. And then the last thing is how all of these things tell a story. That's where we pull in the conceptual part of self-portraiture. You have to have a way that these will come together to give your audience something. Tell a story with your photos. So, self-portraiture is awesome because it gets us out of our comfort zones. You gotta push those boundaries. It challenges us to create scenes from scratch. There's nobody else helping you out. It's all you. So it challenges you to open up that creativity. It helps us feel what our subjects feel. I really like this part of it because we're constantly pointing our cameras at other people, whether it be for your job or just your children, and you want to make sure that you understand what that feels like to have your photo taken because it helps you become a better portrait artist, in my opinion. It can give us confidence. Pointing a camera at yourself can sometimes lower your confidence because you might not like how you look that day. But on days that you look great, you'll be like, wow, I just took a great picture of myself. This is awesome. If I can do it, I can let other people do it. And then other people's pictures of you are not quite as scary. And you always have a model. That is basically the main reason I got into self-portraiture, is because I had no one around. I had no one to take pictures of. I didn't want to bug all my friends every day, so I just started putting myself in front of the camera, and you'll see many of those. But one more thing I wanted to mention, a way that a lot of people like to venture into a new form of photography is through a project. So I wanted to show you a project of one of my past students who's a wonderful person. Her name's Philippa Dugas, and she was a student last year in our summer intensive program. And she decided that for her final project at our school, she wanted to do a self-portraiture project. And that's a great way to start with self-portraiture because it's not just one shot, everything has to be encapsulated in one picture. You get to spread it out and you get to tell a story with multiple shots. It's great. So I wanted to show this to you. And this is a great project. I'm really proud of her for doing it, and she really enjoyed the process. So Philippa, she attended our school and she was missing her children the entire time. She was from Seattle, moved to Montana for 5 months, and she had to be away from them. So she was telling her story through the emotion present in her photographs. She was also happy to be at RMSP, so there's our sign. You can see she was very excited. She was sending letters home to her children, walking to school every day, hanging out with her friends. She made a lot of great friends. She was telling me that she really loved this portrait of herself because she felt that it really encapsulated her entire time at the school. And so it was important for her to take this shot to remember. And then lastly, this one. This is her with her group of students that she became friends with during that summer. And so all of these things came together. Each piece of the puzzle has a piece of Philippa in the image, and yet they don't all have to be in one spot. So I really like this idea. I think a project is a great way to start with self-portraiture. So what's my process? Self-portraiture is probably the most unapologetically terrifying thing I've ever done, but it's also the most rewarding and enlightening process. So I hope that when you learn about what I do, it will rub off on you a little bit. The basic selfie, that's where we'll start. And I'm not talking iPhone selfie. We're gonna do real selfies. You set up your camera, you stand in front of it, and you think about what you're going to take. It's not just a snapshot. And in my opinion, it's best to really get comfortable best to really get comfortable using yourself as your subject before you launch into creating really advanced concepts with your photos. So just get used to being in front of the camera, take a nice portrait of yourself, experiment a little, and then you'll get into the conceptual stuff and really work with that. This was my first self-portrait I ever took. This was 6 years ago against my bedroom wall in high school. And this took me about 500 shots to get a photo that I liked of myself. Oh yeah, took me quite some time. Part of the reason was focus. It's very hard to focus on yourself when you're in front of your camera. I'll explain how to get over that hurdle. But this took literally more than 500 pictures, so that is quite a bit. Don't let that discourage you. That should remind you that it can be pretty tricky at times. But I ended up with a photo that I kind of like. I think I would change so many things about it now, but I started somewhere. So don't worry about that. Make a portrait of yourself because that is the hardest part. One tip is, if you're nervous about getting in front of the camera, don't start with your face. There are so many other wonderful self-portraits that you can take that don't have to include your face, if it makes you uncomfortable. For example, there's quite a few here where they're a little bit anonymous. You're not quite sure who's in the photograph. And these are actually shots that I would encourage you to take because a lot of people can resonate with them. So if you're sharing your work on the internet or anywhere really, people really appreciate these shots because there is no face and they feel like they could be the one in the image. So people really tend to resonate with this type of picture. Here are a couple more. So these are all, you can't tell who it is, you just experiment. Come up with some ideas, put yourself in the shot, and see what you come up with. Feet pictures are one of my favorite. Just put your feet in the picture, you don't need anything else. But one thing I would recommend is to treat your self-portraits like a portrait. They are portraits, they're not just selfies. You want to take some time with them. It's just of yourself, by yourself, nothing too crazy. You want to consider everything and forget that it's just you. So you want to think about lighting because that's something we always pay attention to when we're photographing other people. You want to think about the clothes. You want to, when you're shooting a portrait session, you want to consider what they're wearing and whether or not that affects how you shoot, or if you recommend a certain type of clothing. Locations, you want to consider where you are because it's very important to have a scene that relates to the story that you're trying to tell with your image. At the beginning, don't worry too much about that. Just have fun with it. You want to get into it and just enjoy yourself. Get used to putting yourself in front of the camera. Expressions, this is where you can play. You can learn that your face is more expressive than you think it is. And that's a very fun way to start. So first I wanted to mention portrait lighting in general. We have a few standard setups that work well, that we know we can play with. And these are Rembrandt, split, loop, front, backlight, and butterfly lighting. How many of you are familiar with these? Quite a bit. So they're mentioned all the time in portraiture. These also apply to self-portraiture. So don't throw all of your technical skills out the window just because you're standing in front of your camera. You want to make sure you think about everything. So here's an example. Even with window light, this is Rembrandt lighting. You can see that triangle of light on the side of my eye, Rembrandt lighting. Here's split lighting, completely split down the center of the nose. This is loop lighting. You get that little carrot triangle off the edge of the nose. Front lighting, just pure straight light coming in from a window. Backlighting was all coming behind on a morning sunrise, very pretty. And then butterfly lighting. You can tell butterfly lighting just by a tiny little shadow underneath the nose. And this was actually flash. This was the first picture that I experimented with flash photography. I guess you kind of need to know the story behind it. I shaved my head 3 years ago, and during that time, when I put a hat on my head, when I take it off, lint gets stuck to the top of my head, and it was very frustrating. So I thought that would be a funny concept in a photo. So that's where some of my concepts come from. Just like, hey, this is funny, let's see what it looks like in a picture. So those are our generic lighting setups, and you want to be able to experiment with those because they can totally alter the shape of your face, and they keep you from getting bored with yourself. Because if you're in the same light, in the same place, and you take a selfie there every day, you're going to get bored. So you want to position your face, position your body, position the light any different way so that you can experiment, so that you don't get bored with what you're doing. By far, my most common lighting scenarios are 3 of them. The first is side light, because I tend to use window light quite often. If you can find a nearly blank wall by a window, that will be the happiest time of your self-portrait life, because the possibilities are absolutely endless. It's a very easy, nice studio. So all of these were taken in my various homes that I've lived in, and they were all window light. Backlight is the next one that I use quite a bit. And these are all just shot against a window or against the sun, and they were all just backlit light. And as long as you're considering all of the normal portrait settings, exposing properly and focusing, all that, you're gonna get a great picture out of backlight. And it's one of the most fun types of light to play with, in my opinion. The third is overcast or shaded lighting. These are the other types of lighting scenarios I like to put myself in, because when it's an overcast day or it's very shady in the area where you're trying to shoot, it's a very pleasing lighting scenario. Just like in portraiture, it's a great place to put yourself. So those are the 3 places that I tend to look, 3 types of lighting that I tend to look for, which are, what was the first one? Front lighting? No, side lighting, backlight, and shade. All right, so now that we have some ideas there, we know what type of lighting, we know what ideas we're looking for, you want to just start shooting. And like I mentioned before, it's so important to just get out there, just try it. You might hate that first picture, you might hate the first 500, but you're going to get yourself out there, and that's the most important part. So I encourage you to try everything, and that means that even the things that might not turn out so well. So I wanted to show you, this is normal. You're going to get a bunch of bad pictures of yourself. It's inevitable. You're going to take some horrible ones. And ironically, it makes everyone else's pictures that they take of you seem pretty tame. So that's how you learn to get comfortable with yourself. Here's a few of mine. Some really bad pictures of myself. It's normal. This one, I was trying to grow a plant out of my mouth. Didn't work out very well. There's a bunch of failed attempts. These are a bunch that I was like, oh, this is going to be the best self-portrait I've ever taken. And when it came down to it, I really wasn't too happy about any of these. So you're going to get a lot where you're not too happy with the outcome, but that should never deter you from starting to shoot again. You're also going to get the goofy ones on those days when you just can't take yourself seriously. And I've had a lot of those. And they're fun. It's good not to take yourself too seriously. So don't be afraid of those. The hardest part, though, we haven't even talked about yet, and that is getting inspired. So, what inspires you? Any ideas?
Just shooting.
Just shooting? That's great. So just having your camera with you?
Dressing up, fashion.
Dressing up, fashion. That's great. So clothes, props. Perfect. Anyone else? Costume? Yep, costumes are fun. Is there another one?
Interesting backgrounds.
Interesting backgrounds. Great places to shoot. Yep.
Taking advantage of good lighting.
Great lighting. Yep, I completely agree. Did you have one?
Motion blur.
Motion blur. That can be very fun. I'll show you one in a few minutes. Great. So I agree with all of those, and I have a list, and many of you hit on them. What I get inspired by are Lighting, like you mentioned. Great light can really get you in the mood to just point your camera at anything. And if you don't have a person with you and you really want to shoot a portrait in a situation, just put yourself in there. It's not too bad. And the more you do it, the more easy it becomes. There's also props and clothes. So it could be costumes, it could be makeup, it could be anything that makes you feel like this is going to look great in a portrait. And I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to try it, see what it looks like, and it might become really awesome. There's locations, so different places that you'll go to that will really make you think, wow, there needs to be a picture taken here. Put yourself in the situation, see if you like it. And then the last one I have is concepts and stories, which is ideas that you might come up with that you think just really need to be told in photograph form. Use yourself, because you're a very willing model. So I wanted to start with unique light. This is something that inspires me quite a bit. And that is because if I stumble on a situation and I'm thinking, well, I'm going to have to use a flash because this lighting is horrible. That's not ideal for me. I really like to use natural light as much as possible, and it's very inspiring because it's already there, it's beautiful, and it's almost like it was put there just for you in that moment. So you really want to take advantage of it. And there's a few situations where I've found light like that I really love. And it's very fun to experiment and see what you can do with that. There's a motion blur example. My hair is kind of flowing. So these are all situations where there was very unique light. And the only ones where I used flash were those two in the bottom and the middle. And I like those, and I put those in here because flash can be a great thing to play with when you don't have that natural light there. And it can do cool things, like I put the flash inside of a dryer, and I got inside of a dryer. That was fun. But when you run out of ideas, you'll come up with weird stuff like this. So often I'll think, wow, that's really beautiful light. I want to stand in it. Here's a few more. Just amazing lighting scenarios. I'm really interested in this photo on the bottom right. I wanted to mention this was just a shadow that was coming in on the living room wall, and it looked like it was grabbing something. And I really wanted to just put a person there just to show that emotion. It looks like it's grabbing you on the arm. Very cool. So look for that weird light. But props and clothes are one of the other most important things with self-portraiture. You want to really consider what you're putting in your shot because it can make or break the photo. So with props and clothes, I generally will, be out walking around, wandering through a thrift store, and I see this wonderful lantern or something that I think would be amazing to use in a self-portrait. And so I'll pick it up. Sometimes it's chalk. I'll find chalk in the garage and I'll use that. So basically anything can work. Anything that you think when you're holding it, wow, this is great. This could be perfect. You'll get a little flash of inspiration. Just ride it. And so I've had a few of those. I wanted to show you some of the times when the props or the clothes were actually the reason behind me taking this image. So here are a few of them. Christmas lights are very fun to play with. I highly recommend them. I have a typewriter in that top middle photo. You can't really tell from this far. That lantern was picked up at a thrift store. Books, flower crowns that my friend Teresa, who's a wonderful flower artist, has made for me. So basically anything that you find might be very useful. A couple others are teacups. I love teacups. They are one of the best props that you can find because they always look great in photographs. So grab your teacups. There's the chalk, binoculars, and you can see in this top right photo, I was also paying attention to the clothes. The clothes really help tell the story in that image because it makes it seem dated, it makes it seem older. So having those binoculars in the older type form, it looks pretty cool. So you want to consider how you might dress up for a certain scene to tell that story. So how to choose those clothes, that is the fun part, because not all clothes are the same. So my number one rule is the clothes should never, ever detract from your scene. Should never be distracting, they should never be annoying, they should never be noticed, really, unless they're meant to be noticed. They should really just help tell that story. So props and clothes are very important. They should be fairly plain. I encourage no logos because You know, that bright Coca-Cola on your t-shirt would be a little distracting. So you want to be careful with that. And in my opinion, everyday items make the best props because they're already there. You don't have to go out and find anything new. A toothbrush could be a funny prop. Anything that you have in your house. Your dog, your cat, they can be great props. So you just want to be very intentional with what you choose to put in your photograph. Location. This is the other one that really inspires me often. Sometimes you'll come upon a location and you'll just be ready to shoot. Sometimes you'll come upon a location and say, man, I really should take a picture here, but I'm not feeling it. I don't want to do it, but this is the coolest place I've seen in my entire life. What are you going to do at that point? It's kind of tough. And in general, I've gone both ways. I've said, you know, I'm done. I'm not inspired. I'm just going to go. Other times I've said, I guess I'm going to take a picture, even though it's grudge work and I don't really want to do it. And honestly, when I do the photo, when I wasn't wanting to, those are always my best shots. I don't know why, but that's always how it works out. If I'm in a beautiful place and I'm thinking, hey, I don't really want to do this, if you do it anyway, I don't know, there's something about the emotion behind it. I think they work out better. So I would encourage you to, if a place speaks to you, just take the leap and take the shot. Whether it's you, whether it's a friend, whether it's just the place itself, take that picture. Here are a couple examples. This was actually taken about 4 days ago. We were in Atlanta, Georgia, and that was just a beautiful forest that we were walking through, and I was very interested in the scene. I didn't really want to take a picture. Forrest back there, who's my husband, he spoke earlier today. He actually really encouraged me to take this shot, and I'm glad I did, because I think the trees are really beautiful. Another one on a beach. Beaches are great. And then here are a couple more shots where the location really made a difference in the images. And they really made the picture. If I wasn't shooting in that spot, I wouldn't have had the idea that I came up with. I let the location lead me in a direction for a picture. And I feel like that's actually 90% of the time where I get the most of my inspiration. I'll come upon a certain place and I'll say, wow, that's perfect. That needs this pose, that needs this clothing, and I just have to do it. So if it's not the right time, I'll go back home, get all those things, and then come back. Maybe even wait for the best light, because locations can really make or break a photo. So how do you find those locations? Because, you know, they're not always right out your back door. So in my opinion, I love open spaces, you know, wide open expanses, which are really great when you can find them, but sometimes hard to find. Trees, anywhere you can find trees, they make great friends in your photos. And blank walls. Blank walls are endlessly wonderful because anything can happen there, especially if you push yourself with Photoshop, which I've learned to really embrace in the self-portrait process, is you can do literally anything with a blank wall. It's like a studio. The other thing I would mention is a location that's great for you is anywhere you actually feel comfortable making camp, because you're going to be taking out your tripod, you're going to be taking out your camera, and you're going to be blocking traffic or whatever you need to do to get this shot. So you need to be comfortable with it. Otherwise, you're not going to create the best photograph. So you want to make sure that you're ready and able to make camp wherever you are. Or you just do it really quickly, but I don't advise that because you won't get the best shot there either. The other thing I like to do is look for unique light sources in that location. Find a place that has really cool light, and sometimes that can guide you. So I like street lights, lamps, neon signs, stoplights can be fun, and graveyards actually have really beautiful lighting. So if you haven't explored a graveyard, there can be really beautiful places there. So those are some places where you can find outside. But I also would encourage you to exhaust the places that you can find in your own house, in your own apartment, wherever you are, and embrace any window light you possibly have. I've lit an entire photo by the light coming underneath a crack in a door. So boost that ISO, sometimes you might need to, because you can take amazing photographs in your own home that you might not have even noticed before. So notice your own home. There can be wonderful places there. So that's what we think about when we're taking a general selfie. How do we turn that into conceptual self-portraiture? So I have some suggestions how you can come up with some inspiration that will lead you to a specific story-like topic, a topic that will be interesting and basically make a viewer feel like they're in a scene, in a different time or a different place, something that will make them moved by your photograph. And one way that I really love to get inspired for conceptual images is by listening to songs. You know, we all know when you listen to a great song that tells a story or that has that one lyric that really gets you, put that into an image. See how you can illustrate that. Like if you were just going to put that into material form, what would it look like for you? I like to listen to songs because they really make you think differently about your own life or about how you can be inside of that image. I also like to read books for the same reason. There are so many little pieces of books that will really lead you to a certain place in your mind that it's something you can't find anywhere else. So I like to read books and find those little pieces. I've done Harry Potter themed photos before. Those are fun. Just by little tiny bits in the book that really just hit you. So think about that. If you're ever lacking in inspiration, also pick up a book, read a line, do it. Just make a picture out of it. That's a great way when you're not feeling it with your photography. I also like to daydream. Some of the best images will come when you just clear your mind and think about nothing in particular. Let anything show up, and you can get some of the best images from that process. And then one of the most important, probably the most important, in my opinion, is to look at other photographers' work. And I'll mention a lot more photographers, more than you saw at the beginning. So you're gonna learn a lot more of the people who inspire me to get out there and actually try these things. So looking at other photographers, especially self-portrait artists, if that's what you're trying to do, will really help you out. Also, pull on themes from your own life. If there are specific moments that really impacted you as a person, maybe turn that into a portrait. It doesn't have to be anything you share with anyone else, but it can be a really cathartic process to really work through your own self and just learn more about what you want to do with your art. Another thing I love, capture yourself doing your favorite things. You saw a picture of me drinking tea. You saw a picture of me reading a book. Those are two things that I love. You also saw me climbing a tree. Just photograph you in what you love to do. It could be photographing yourself at your office. And I've done that too. And you just want to try everything because if you're continuing to shoot, you will make better pictures down the line. So, in my opinion, the best ideas are the ones that come naturally. And these are some images that I've taken where I didn't even have an idea for a concept until I showed up, got out my camera, and decided, what can I do here? So in most cases, I actually don't have an idea going into a place. I just let my mind roam. And when I show up to a certain location, obviously that's very important on dictating what I might shoot in the area, but also just having a prop on hand. So in all of these images, everything was specifically chosen to be in or out of the image. And that's very important when you're going through any type of photograph, when you're doing any type of photography. But I also think it's very important with self-portraiture because this is self-expression at its truest form. You are putting yourself in the image and you want to make sure that you represent that concept accurately. Don't let fear guide you. I don't know if any of you have read the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. It is a great book. I'm in the middle of it right now, and it is beautifully written. And it's very important. I would encourage every person who's creative to read that book because she talks all about how you can just get out there. You can do whatever you want to do, and you can push yourself. And she talks about all of the drawbacks that we all think in our heads and that keeps us from doing what we might want to do. And I want to mimic her today by saying don't let fear guide you, because fear is one of the biggest crushers of creativity, and you need a lot of creativity to experiment with self-portraiture. So the biggest thing is to not be afraid of what the concept is, of what people might think of the photograph you're taking, of anything. If a concept resonates with you, then do it. If it's weird or even scary stuff, just do it anyway. It can be very cathartic just to get these things out of your head and onto an image. It's a wonderful way to express yourself. So These are some images that I've also worked through with concepts. So concepts of what I might have been thinking at the moment or what I wanted to portray with a certain situation. And they all were just made on the spot, really. Or when I got back, looked at the image in Lightroom, I did a little bit of Photoshop or Lightroom manipulation to the image to make it illustrate the point that I thought it should illustrate. That winged photo in the middle is one of them. I had no idea what I was going to do until I got home. I saw that the dust that I kicked up had been making this weird shape. It looked almost like a wing. So I just Photoshopped it a little bit to make it look more like a wing. So you can play a lot, and sometimes you won't know what you want until you get back to base camp, and that's okay. So we're doing conceptual self-portraiture now. We've moved past the basic self-portrait, and we're looking at how do we tell a story. So I was educated in photojournalism. That was my bachelor's degree. I love photojournalism, how to tell a story, and that might be partially why I love self-portraiture. It's kind of a fine art take on things. And in that degree, we learned a lot about what actually makes a great story. And it was wonderful to learn those things because they all can be applied to any type of photograph. So I have a few up here for you that I think will really help you through the process. And that is many things that make a great story. The first is mood. What will the colors and tones and the lighting make the viewer feel? How is that image going to be seen? And that should be very intentional. The next is expression. How is the expression of the person, whether it be you or anyone in any type of photography, going to impact the viewer? How is it going to make them think about that image? So you want to consider that when you're trying to tell a specific story, because the expression should fit everything else in the image. Juxtaposition. This is a very common photojournalism technique, which is something you might have two elements in an image that contrast with each other. Two different types of the image, or two different parts of the image that will really tell a story just by being in the same spot together. That can be very interesting. The next is emotion, obviously one of the most crucial elements because that is what the viewer will see and feel. And the last one is content. So what actually is that story that you're trying to tell? And is it evident? You want to make sure that the story that you're trying to put forward is very obvious and evident so that someone will get it. Or if you really want to just make it a little bit arbitrary, do that intentionally. It might mean something to you, and you might not really care what someone else takes from it, and that's okay too. Everyone can interpret things a little bit differently. We see them through our own lenses. But if you have a specific type of content that you want someone to get from it, make that evident, make it intentional. And when you're struggling, it is my first and foremost thing that I do to just grab anything. Grab one thing in my house, take it to my little blank wall, and see what I can do with it. Because you're going to be struggling. I'm actually in the middle of a 365 project right now. I started it on January 1st, so I'm taking an image every day. I'm not forcing myself to do self-portraits every day because I've done that and it didn't end at a full 365 days. So I'm just doing whatever I want, but you run out of inspiration very quickly. That's just how those things work. So you have to push yourself to stay inspired, otherwise it's just gonna fall flat. So I like to just grab something, grab anything. You can hold it, you can stand next to it, you can stick it to your face, you can do whatever you want. But concepts are really great because they allow you to dig into those deepest parts of yourself and find something that you can illustrate in a photograph, and it's very, very fun. You are an endless well of ideas. There are so many things in your brain that you might not even know you have in there. And if you just call them up and put them in a photograph, you can really experiment. And I encourage you to really try everything, even those weird things like putting glass on your face. That was a broken frame. I thought, what can I do with this? Let's stick it on my face. I don't know why. And one thing I love is never underestimate the power of a diptych or a triptych or a quadtych. That is just a pairing of images. So multiple images in one shot. And you can do that in Lightroom or Photoshop. And the reason I lean toward diptychs often is because sometimes the whole story cannot be told in just one image. Or maybe you don't want it to be. You want things to be a little bit separate, but paired. You want to pair. So I've done many diptychs in the past, and often you'll see diptychs are a wide angle and a close-up of one specific shot. And you can see that here. I've got a couple of those. But I think diptychs are very fun. There's a 6-tick. That one was fun too. But I think diptychs are a great way to really just not worry too much. You can just take a bunch of photos of one situation and then just play. See which ones work well together, see which ones you like. And if you can't decide on an image, sometimes I'll do that. Maybe you narrowed it down to 2 or 3 or 5 images and you just don't know which one that you want to keep. Don't know which one's the best of that scene. Put them all together. They all mean something to you clearly, so they should have a spotlight. So that's a little bit about the context, a little bit about the concepts that you can come up with. But I have a problem sometimes that I wanted to tell you guys about. And that is when it comes down to the technical stuff. So we know how to get inspired. We know how to come up with concepts now. But we're going to talk more from now on about how to actually get to that point. How are you going to use your photographic techniques and your gear and your technology to really make this all come to fruition? So I wanted to explain a problem to you. And that is the problem of wide-angle lenses, which can be very useful in many applications of photography. But with self-portraiture, I find a problem. And that is, I generally will be shooting with a 50mm lens. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I shoot with a 50 because I don't want too much depth of field. I like a shallow depth of field. It's a very common portraiture technique to have very little depth of field in your image, and that just means very little that's sharp. And I find a problem with wide-angle lenses because they don't do that for me. A wide-angle lens inevitably will have more depth of field. That's just the nature of the optics. So I shoot with a 50mm often, but what happens when I want a wider scene, but my 50mm is too tight to give that to me? But I want to keep the shallow depth of field. What do you think we can do in that situation? What was that? Telephoto? Still a little bit too far because I actually want that wide angle. I want to see more of the scene without losing that shallow depth of field. So I wanted to teach you about one technique that I really love, and that is the Brenneser method of expansion. So this gets a little bit into the technical world of Lightroom and Photoshop, and I'll talk about both of them. But the Brenneser method of expansion is something that I use in my self-portraiture very often. And that is because it's a way that you can get a wide field of view and a very shallow depth of field in one shot. Well, it actually takes a couple shots, but we'll talk about that. And I'll actually demonstrate it for you because I have my camera here. So the Brenneser method of expansion is basically you're going to start by taking an image, and that will be the image that contains the person, whether it be you or anyone else you're shooting, and you'll start by taking that portrait image. Then you'll switch your camera to manual focus because you don't want the camera to refocus when you're trying to take more pictures later on, because you're going to take images of the surrounding area around the portrait and you're going to stitch them all together in Photoshop or Lightroom at the very end. So this is a technique that allows you to maintain that shallow depth of field of the 50mm lens, but then you just add more area just by moving your camera and shooting different images. It's very similar to a panorama images, if any of you have ever shot a panorama. So it's a very cool way that you can experiment with both Photoshop and photography techniques, and I really love it. Brenneser method of expansion was started by a portrait photographer named Ryan Brenneser. He's a portrait and wedding artist, and he just kind of, I don't know if he was the first one to do it, but I think he was, and he just kind of came up with this thing and called it the Brenneser method of expansion. So we're going to talk about that, and I wanted to show you a couple of images that used that method. This is one of them. This is a very shallow depth of field, right? But it actually shows a pretty large area, and this is where it started. So the top left image is actually the image that I took of myself. That's the portrait. And then I took a ton of images around myself, to create that larger image on the top right. Then I added the birds and then I edited it. So that's how the Brennizer method of expansion works. Here's another one. So this is this fun running through the forest one I had. I wanted to take a photo like this for years, and I finally did it last summer, and I really love how it turned out. This is where it started. So it was actually just a pretty close-up image. I took a bunch of photos around the scene, stitched them all together, and then I decided what I wanted, which ended up being the slightly cropped-in version. But I like how it turned out. Here's another one, this one that I just did in Georgia. Started like this. So I took the image of myself, took a bunch of images around it, stitched them together. One more. This one I wanted to show you because I actually did this with Lightroom's automatic panorama stitching. It cut me out of it. So it was very frustrating. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is how it started. I just took multiple images of this certain scene, and then I ended up putting myself in it again and got a nice picture. Here are a few more that just utilized that method. Many of my images use this method. I really enjoy it. And it doesn't actually take too long. So let's talk a little bit more technical. What is the easiest way to take a self-portrait? What settings do you use? What gear do you use? How do you get started with that? So we're going to talk first about the setup because that's the most important part to get you off and running. And the first is a sturdy tripod. You're going to be running back and forth to it, and you don't want to accidentally knock it over and it's gone. So none of those gorilla pods. Make sure that you have something very sturdy. And I also would recommend using your camera with a normal-ish lens. What I mean by that is it's somewhere around the 50mm length. Nothing like 14, nothing too wide, nothing like 200. Either one of those are going to infuriate you because too wide, you'll get distorted features, and too tight, you're going to have to be very far away from your camera in most situations. So I really like the 50mm. That is by far my go-to lens. It's the perfect length, and it does great things for maintaining the actual look of your face. You don't have any weird distorted features, and you're also not kind of squished. So I really like the normal lens. 35mm are great too, but it can sometimes be a little too wide, especially when I'm going for the expansion. I like to stick with the 50mm because it gives you that shallower depth of field that you really need to make that effect look its best. Remote, we talked about this, so you want to make sure that you have some way to trigger your camera remotely because it gets very frustrating very quickly to be running back and forth to your camera. And I'll mention that again. And then the last one is just an intentional outfit. That is probably the fourth most important thing with your self-portraiture. You want to really consider what you're wearing because you're going to be the subject in your photograph that will tell a story. So here are some examples of some remotes that I'd recommend. This is the Canon RC6. I used this for years and years. Great remote. It has a couple of faults. That is, you can't be more than 16 feet away from your camera. So if you're trying to be farther, this is not the remote for you. But it's only $20. Great remote, just getting you into the scene. B&H has them probably right out the door. So I really like this remote. This is the Nikon equivalent, the ML-L3. And these are just great. They can sometimes have a bit of a problem when you're pointing them at your camera, which is also pointing them at the sun because they're infrared. So the light sensor will sometimes be distracted by the sun. It won't quite work properly. So again, if you're shooting in a lot of situations like that, it might not be the best for you. But in general, these are great. I used them for 5 years. They're wonderful. Eventually, you might want to move up to something a little bit different, which is, I actually just got one of these, and I'm very excited about it because this is a radio trigger, which allows you to be as far away, up to 320 feet, I think, from your camera. So you can be very far. You can be on a mountaintop, a short mountain, and you can shoot down to your camera. And this one's not much more expensive. So I really like this because it allows you to be further. It also has some triggers on the remote itself for you to be able to change the delay, and you can actually hold it down halfway, hold the trigger button down halfway, and that will focus for you, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So it can be very useful. So I really like these triggers. They've worked well for me. There's also many others out there. Feel free to do research. But having that remote trigger is very important. And I only lasted about 3 weeks when I first started doing self-portraiture before I got one, because you'll realize very quickly that it's... All right, so let's talk about the process. The process of shooting is actually, it's gonna look a little scary, but it's not, I'll promise. And that is just a few steps. So number one, you wanna switch your camera to shutter button focusing. And what I mean by that is there are 2 ways that you can focus on your camera. There's a button on the back of your camera that you can touch with your thumb that will allow you to focus independently from the shutter. A lot of people love that method, but when it comes to self-portraiture, you're going to want to switch it back to the shutter button. If you don't know what any of that is, don't worry, it's automatically on your shutter button, so you're ready to go. So I want to make sure that it's on shutter button focusing. I want to set my ISO to 100 or 200, whatever your native ISO is for your camera, which will be in your manual. It's usually the lowest ISO on your camera. And the reason for that is you don't want unnecessary noise in almost any situation. So set it low. Then I set my aperture, or the desired f-stop for the situation. In general, that's around f2 for me. I really like shallow depth of field, so having that aperture very wide really helps with that. And then I will meter the scene. And just like any other type of photography, you just walk through all those steps. I meter the scene, make sure that it's properly exposed without me in it. So don't stress about putting yourself in front, because as long as everything's properly exposed in the scene, once you put yourself in it, you will be properly exposed as well. Then I adjust my shutter speed until that scene is perfect. I only adjust the ISO above 100 or 200 if absolutely necessary for the lighting situation. So I try to keep it low, I put my f-stop where I want it, and then I use my shutter speed to just play with that. And the reason I might have to change my ISO is if my shutter speed was too slow for me to stand still and not be moving. So you don't want that motion blur. Then I set the focal point on my camera to where I think I will be in the scene once I get there. And this is actually probably the most important part of the entire process. What I mean by that, you know when you can change that little red square or green square, whatever it is on your camera, you just want to set that to the area where you intend to stand. And you can be a little bit off. You'll have to play with it to learn a little bit about how the length of your lens interacts with where those focal points are. But if you set your focal point to where you think you'll be, that will help you a lot once you get into the situation. So, last is set your camera to self-timer mode, because whether you're using a remote or not, it has to be on self-timer mode. The remotes that are the $20 remotes, they require you to be on self-timer mode for them to work. And then if not, you're running back and forth, so it's also very important. I have some tips on how you might go about that. So tip number one, don't be afraid of weird positions when you're getting into the positions for shooting these strange self-portraits that Sarah's telling you about. Don't be afraid of them, because they don't actually look as weird when it's on the camera, when you look at it later. So try everything. Don't be too concerned about how you're looking. Take a lot of shots with differing expressions before you look at the back of your camera. A lot of people make the mistake of taking one shot, looking at the back of their camera, saying, oh, I look horrible, and then never going back and taking any more pictures. So I don't want you to do that. I want you to stand in front of the camera, take a few pictures, try a few different expressions, and then look at the back and see which ones you might like best. Don't look at the back after that first shot. It's not ideal. All right, calm yourself down. This is the next one. You want to be relaxed. You want to make sure that you are just embracing the idea that you're going to be taking pictures of yourself for the foreseeable, 5 or 10 minutes. So you want to make sure that you're being relaxed. Next, you are playing a character in a scene that you create. So you can play yourself, you can play someone else. You can let your imagination run wild. So don't be too afraid of just trying something. And I really think this is fun. Some days I feel like an actress, which is kind of cool. But I would never want to be on TV. So you can play yourself, you can play someone else, play different periods in your own life. It's very fun. The next one, probably the most important at first. Work alone. I wouldn't even let Forrest be near me for the first couple years of us knowing each other. I don't like when someone's near me while I'm taking a self-portrait because it makes me nervous about what other people might be seeing me, the weird expressions I'm making, the story I'm trying to tell, the strange way I'm holding my hand. It can be a little weird at first, so don't be afraid to just kick your whole family out of the room when you're taking these pictures at first. I recommend shooting a lot of photos of yourself. This could be on the same day, on multiple days, on every day that you possibly shoot, because you'll learn your good sides. And that's a really nice place to be, because then you know which way you want to angle your face, angle your body so that you look your best. And that's great, because we all want to feel our best when we look at the pictures. I really encourage you to don't always include your face, because faces do not equal self-portraits. Self-portraits can be anything, anything that has you in it. And one thing I actually really like is one of my coworkers back at RMSP. She is a visual studies teacher, so she teaches all about the visual side of photography, composition and history and everything like that. She says that every photo you ever take is a self-portrait. And I really like that because you are always putting yourself, your lens, into any photo you take, but especially when you're in the scene. So you want to make sure that you think about that when you're putting yourself in the photo. Leg photos are cool too, and you've seen a few of those. Feet photos are cool. So I'm going to demonstrate this for you. I want to show you guys what I do when I'm getting ready to take a picture, because it's easier to see when you see someone do it. So I have my camera here, and I'm ready to take a shot, and I have my method of success. So once I have my camera on, and I actually have that little Velo trigger that's wireless that I told you about, the one that goes up to 320 feet, I'm going to set my settings properly for the situation. And then I'm going to make sure that I have my antenna out so everything works. It's got the cute little antenna, isn't that great? And then, as long as my focal point is where I'm going to be, which for now, it's right in the center. And honestly, most of the time, I shoot with the focal point in the center because it's easy to know from this side of the camera where the center of your lens is. And the important part at this point is to position yourself in front of that focal point, which for now is the center. And then you'll just take the picture. You heard it. So it actually just took a shot of me. So that's what happens when you're getting ready to take that shot. You want to just get in the position, get where you need to be, just position yourself so that you can see that you're in the middle of the lens. That works best for me. And then take a few. I already broke my own rule. I only took one and then I went back, but I'm not going to look at it. So then you want to make sure that you have that best shot. Get ready to go. I'm going to smile. All right. And then let me demonstrate one other thing, which is how do you take those expansion photos? Because that's kind of a new thing for most of us, I think. And it can be a little bit daunting if you haven't done it before. So I wanted to show you just my method up here of how I would go about that. I just took a picture of myself, right? I took a portrait of myself in the middle of this camera. I made sure that I got my whole top of my head in the picture. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch my lens to manual focus, which is very important. We mentioned that when we talked about Brennizer expansion. I'm going to switch it to manual because I don't want the camera to refocus as soon as I push this button again. And there, now it's on manual. All I need to do is loosen my tripod head so that I can move it a little bit. I'm going to scoot the camera to the left a little, take a picture, scoot it up, take a picture, put it over my head where I know is just above where my last composition was, take a picture, go up in top right corner. I generally like to go in a square unless I have any other aspect ratio in mind. Take to the side, and then you're done. The important thing with these is, just like with a panorama, you want to make sure that each image overlaps just a little bit. Generally, 20 to 30% is a great portion of the image that you want to duplicate in your next shot. Because when you're stitching together in Photoshop, you need a little bit of extra room to make all of those photos look seamless. So now that I've got all those pictures taken, I can take them back to my computer and I can stitch them together. That's what I do to take the image. If I want to expand, I take those extra photos around the edge And then I have options. I will want to edit it in Lightroom. So I want to actually bring it in and show that to you guys. How do I actually go through that process? And to do that, I'm going to open up Lightroom here. So I'm not going to use the images that I just took, because those are probably the worst images I've ever taken. But I have a couple of examples here for you that I wanted to show how I would walk through this process. So there's an image here. This is one that I took at, oops, you guys can't see this. There you go. So there's an image here. This is a photo that I took outside Forrest's parents' house, actually. And this was taken for the purpose of showing an expansion. So it's very, I made sure that I overlapped everything so that nothing would mess up. And now I can show you what I'm going to do. So over here, you can see I have one picture here. That is the one of myself. There's one just to the left of what you guys were seeing, top left and top right. So I can form a square with myself in the bottom right. That was the goal for this image. So then I can actually go back, and I wanted to show you two methods of putting this photo together. In Lightroom, if you haven't worked in Lightroom 6 before, there is a really cool option for creating a panorama right inside of the program. You used to have to go to Photoshop for everything. But if you're interested in trying it in Lightroom, which usually works pretty well, you can go Photo Merge after you right-click on the image. Right-click, go Photo Merge, and then choose that panorama option. What it's going to do, it's going to pop up a screen, and it's going to create a preview for you of what that image might look like. And this is probably the easiest box that you'll ever run into in Lightroom. You can see it almost did a perfect job. Look at that. And I would encourage you to always keep Auto Select Projection on, because Lightroom's smart enough to know what type of distortion would be best for merging all these images together and making them look realistic. So I think it did a great job. It chose spherical for me. You can see that here. And then you just hit the merge button. So it's actually going to create that. It was only doing a preview for us in that box. So that's how Lightroom can allow you to work through this process fairly quickly. But I've encountered many problems with Lightroom's panorama stitching if I do not do my overlapping properly, because, I mean, that happens with any panorama. If you don't overlap enough, it will ruin it, and you won't be able to stitch it all together. There will be gaps. So, but what happens with the self-portraits that I tend to expand is I will make a mistake of, say, including too much of the wall above my head. Let's say that. Let's say on my upper shot, I didn't just include this. I actually went down and I also kind of took a shot like this. Do you guys see a problem with that? That would be, I overlapped a little too much. So that means that Lightroom, when it goes to make this panorama, it gets a little bit confused because I actually get cut out of the frame. So that's what happens when Lightroom's panorama doesn't quite work properly. It will cover me up, the top half of my head. It'll try to blur my chin in maybe a little bit. Just weird things happen. And when that happens, I wanted to show you guys there's another way that you can do it. And that is by taking all 4 of those stitchable photos into Photoshop. And if you're a Lightroom user, they make it very seamless for you. It's great. And you can actually go up to the photo menu at the top here, go to Edit in Adobe Photoshop. And that's how I always like to work, because it allows Photoshop and Lightroom to talk wonderfully. Things can save right back into the program. So it's going to open up all these photos for me in Photoshop. And they're all going to be 4 separate files, because that's how they were shot. So we just have to move them all together. Oop. Let me get my mouse back. There you go. So what happens when we do this? Let's try to shrink this to the screen. All right. So the first step that you're going to want to do is zoom out a little bit, find that first photo. This is that first photo that has your subject in it. And once you have that photo chosen, you know that that's your starting point. So that's your starting point for merging all the others together. And what I like to do to start off this expansion is I actually just grab the crop tool and I expand the width of my canvas. Hit enter to confirm, zoom back out. So now I've just created more area where I can put more photos, more information into the scene by dragging them in. So then I've got that set. I'll go up to my next image, which is to the right of me in the portrait that I took. I'm gonna grab my move tool. That's this tool up in the top right that will allow you to click and drag different items in Photoshop. I'm gonna drag that and I'm gonna drop it on top of the tab that has my expanded canvas. Just drop it in there, wiggle it around a little bit, kind of get it matched up pretty closely to where I think it should go. Then I'm gonna go back and exit out of that photo because I don't need it open, taking up Photoshop time and space. So remember here, when you get to this point, you wanna make sure that you don't save because you don't need a duplicate of this one specific photo. So I'm gonna not save that. Come back, grab the other one, drag it over, drop it in, and there's my top right photo. And I wanna show you a trick here. There are things in Photoshop called blending modes, which allow you to change the way that you see layers interacting with each other. Because Lightroom will shove all of these things on top of each other, and there are tricks to seeing them in a way that will allow you to stitch them all together in an easier light. And that is by changing my blending mode to difference. Then I can move this around, and you can see anywhere where you see not black, that's difference. And so you want to line them up just enough so that you should be able to see them where they will end up being. I'll go back, close that shot, don't save it, grab the last one, move it over, drop it in, and line that one up. And you can see this one's really close to my head, but what's actually happening here is a little bit of distortion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop it there. But this is where the fun starts, because now we just have 4 pictures with very obvious corners on top of each other. We want to blend them. And the way that you will work with that is by, let me get my, oh no. Let me get my window just a little bit smaller, if it will let me. Sorry guys, there it is. All right, so there's a button called the mask button down here at the bottom in Photoshop. And that will add a mask that will allow me to basically paint out certain parts of my image, blend them all together. I'm just gonna grab that, I'm gonna paint on the mask, and I'm gonna turn off certain areas of the image so that I don't see those obvious edges. And I'll even paint out the point where my head intersects. Oop, I made a problem. There we go. So then I'll come back in and I'll just paint that right back in. And this won't be perfect, I'm doing it pretty quickly, but you'll just add a mask to each individual photo and paint out certain areas.
The dream is off too a little bit.
Oh, you're pointing out my problems.
Okay.
Yep, he's right. So the drain is a little bit off at the top. So if I click back on the layer, I can move it back just a little bit by nudging it. See? Better? Yep, so you can go through that. And I'm gonna keep working, just painting out these things. And that's pretty good. Obviously, I would spend a little bit more time on it, but we've got an expansion. And that actually didn't take too long. If you hone your Photoshop skills, you'll get to this point, and it's so easy. It actually didn't take me that long to learn it at all. I'm gonna save this back into Lightroom. I'm gonna exit out of the last photo that I had sitting here. And once this comes back in, I wanna show you my next process, which is, at this point, you have a photo that's going to be sent into Lightroom. I generally, the way that I like to work is I actually will edit through the photo, color correction and effects and things like that in Lightroom because I'm very familiar with Lightroom. I really love it, and it's a little bit easier and non-destructive compared to Photoshop. So I actually will grab the photo that I created and I will work on it in Lightroom. There's an obvious problem at first, which is cropping. So I'm actually going to want to crop off those edges. And I'm going to crop off that little light sticking out in the top. And then you can just work through this photo as normal. So at this point, I would just come in, do all my normal edits. And the first is get rid of my zit. Oops, I have that on. So I'm just going to get that out of there. Very easy, quick. I know that I don't want it. And then I'm just going to work through everything else that I would do with a photograph. So I wanted to show you my process with this. But this photo in particular, I think that I got it pretty good last time I edited it. So I wanted to show you actually what I would do if I edited through this shot. This is another one that I just expanded the other day, and it's a surprise because no one else has ever seen this photo before, so you guys are lucky. You're the first ones. But I wanted to show you what I would do with this because this is a little bit of a trickier edit. It's got a bright, bright red, which can be very hard to deal with in the editing world. So what I wanted to do is just show you my process. So I love Lightroom. It's probably where I have the most fun in, which is kind of like photographer no. You should enjoy shooting more than anything else. And I love to shoot, but I love Lightroom just as much. So I really hope that you will learn a little bit about how I might edit, and I think that it'll be a great tutorial if you're interested in mimicking this type of process. So what I tend to like to do when I go into Lightroom is I've got the photo expanded. This one actually was an expansion. It started a lot smaller. And then I will actually start maybe by trying out a preset. And there's a preset company that I really enjoy called VSCO. They create Lightroom presets, and they can sometimes be a little bit over the top, and they're very hip right now, so they're kind of the thing. But I really like them as a base for starting sometimes. I generally don't stick with just the preset controls, but I like to mouse over on the left, see if there's anything I might like to start with. And let's say I might like to try this. Let's say I like how Kodak Gold looks. It's a type of preset that they've created that mimics the look of Kodak Gold film. I'm going to try it. And then I generally don't agree with everything that they do, but it's a nice starting point. So then I'll come back into my controls over here, and I'll just maybe warm up my white balance a little bit, make sure my highlights are down so that I can see all that beautiful blue in the sky. Bring my whites up just a hair so that I have a bright area. Blacks down so that I have a dark area. And I like my shadows up fairly high, not high enough that you can notice, but enough that we can see all of the detail in those rocks in the image, in those shadows. And then honestly, I always add about 5 to 10 points of clarity to my image because it is not enough that people really notice, but it gives your image a little bit of a punch, a little bit of a crispness. And I really like the look of that. And then I like to use my tone curve. And I wanted to show this to you guys because anyone who's used Photoshop before knows what the tone curve is. It's called curves in Photoshop, and it can be a very powerful tool. It's probably the most powerful tool in all of Photoshop, if you only had to pick one. So they brought it into Lightroom as well. And I wanted to show you what I like to do, which is often I like to create a type of film look. So I'm actually going to click and drag on some of the points on my curve and kind of bring up those deep blacks a little bit. And Lightroom gets a little punchy right there. It kind of freaks out when you nudge against the edge. But you can bring up that corner a little bit. It's going to make a bit of a filmish hue to those deep blacks. And I like the look of that in a lot of situations. I'm going to try it out here. But don't forget that in curves, you also have 3 channels. These are the channels of light that your camera records. You have red, green, and blue. And you can play with those curve channels individually. So because we have red, I might try to pull the red curve down just a little bit to kind of bring the saturation out of the dress. And I'm going to bring that down just a little bit, not enough that I lose that punchy red, which is the whole point of the picture really, but enough that it's not going to get blown out with no detail. And I think we still got some of those wrinkles that actually live in the dress. So that's good. And then what I might do is work on a local adjustment. And Lightroom is great because they have these really easy local adjustments. You don't have to use masks or anything if you don't want to. And I really love the radial filter. It's this little circle right in the top right corner. where you can actually click and drag out a circular adjustment or ellipse-shaped adjustment and adjust either the inside or the outside of that circle. And so I like to generally darken down the outside just enough that the subject will stand out a little bit more. And I really like the look of that. Then I'll hit done. That's, pretty good for now. That's a quick edit. I really love Lightroom, and I probably would spend about 30 more minutes on this one photo just because it's fun to play. But that's a general introduction to my process. And I really like Lightroom because it can make your pictures go from here to here. And it's not making things fake, it's making things how you saw them or how you wanted to see them. Because all that we're doing here is fine art. So it's very fun. So that's kind of where I'd start with Lightroom. But I wanted to reiterate with you guys a little bit more about how we can get inspired. So I wanted to bring that up for you. And that is, if I can get my mouse back, some inspiration before I leave you for the day. You need to be inspired. So we're going to try it out. We're going to try it out by getting you inspired. And the first thing I wanted to share with you is all the other people who inspired me. There are so many amazing photographers out there, specifically who do conceptual self-portraiture. And there's a big list here. You're probably not going to remember all these, right? So I made a link for you on our RMSP website. So if you're interested in reading about all these photographers or reading the list of them so that you can look up their work, this is a link that I've created for you. So take a picture of that one. So I'm going to show you David Talley's work, a few of his images. He's teaching a conceptual portraiture class for us in the future, which is great. He's going to be teaching that this fall. He's an amazing photographer. He actually only started about 5 or 6 years ago as well, which is great. And he does these amazing self-portraits that always tell a unique story. So he definitely does not let anything limit his imagination, and we can appreciate that. So very cool self-portraits. He finds the best props. I think that's all he does, is search for props every day. See, this is something that's very fun. Wide open spaces, something to lean against. And you can see what I love about this image is it's very intentional. Look at his outfit. He fits right in. He looks like a farm boy. It's great. And one last one, and I put his website up here for you if you wanted to see that. But if you Google his name, you'll find it first thing. Very cool. So this is all him. He took, 8 pictures of himself in this situation. I don't even know how he did it, but very cool. Grace Adams is another friend of mine who's a wonderful photographer. She takes more simpler, but still beautiful and telling a story self-portraits. So if you're not too into Photoshop, she's a great one to follow. And I really like this one. She lives in Alaska, so she's got some great backgrounds to choose from, but I think she uses them very well. Another one is my friend Eva. She lives in France. She's constantly shooting in the most beautiful fields I've ever seen. And she takes wonderful shots in all of these places. And one reason I wanted to show Eva's work as well is because she tends to turn her face away in a lot of images. She likes to create the anonymous feel in her photos. And if you're interested in that, she's a great one to follow. I really like how in a lot of her images, you don't see her face. It's very interesting. She has this great hair, which helps, but I can't do that. She does these beautiful shots. I like that one. I think she actually owns a giant pair of scissors. Sarah Ann Loreth, I mentioned her. She was the first one we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. Wonderful, wonderful photographer. She has a beautiful imagination, and she's constantly pushing herself to try new things. And I really like what she comes up with. This one's pretty fun. This one, very interesting. I'm kind of jealous. She got to go to an abandoned mental institution, which I actually find very interesting. Gina Vasquez, she's a wonderful photographer. She's very young, and she's done wonderful self-portraits. She constantly just uses light and location in a great way. She actually lives in New York, so you can't say you can't do it. She takes beautiful self-portraits. This one I love. This is probably my favorite from her. She actually has a little light bulb that she strung down from who knows where that's lighting up her snooze. So this is kind of a daydream photo. Very cool. Alex Stoddard, wonderful photographer as well. Very well known for his work. Kara Kobus, also great. I love this. I don't know how she got that done, but maybe she had a turtle figurine. She's sitting on a turtle. Sig Harvey, one of the tried and true, most wonderful self-portrait artists. I love this image, and I also love this image, and she is just wonderful. Look up her work. She has done whole series on her life through self-portraiture. Very impressive. And this is actually, you could do this the same way that I created an expansion in Photoshop, just with masks and painting on the masks. So don't say you can't do it. You can totally do it. Joel Robeson, he actually, he's a wonderful self-portrait artist, but he recently got a job with Coca-Cola. So he's just making a name for himself. It's great. He does a lot of images where he shrinks himself down, puts himself with or on objects, and I really love that idea. He does a great job with it. Whitney Justison, another friend of mine. She went to Iceland. Great place to take self-portraits. But I think she did a wonderful job. And you can see that she likes to play with body movement. She's just moving herself around, seeing what she can come up with. And I think she does a great job with her imagination. So, wrapping y'all up, some steps to success for self-portraiture. Let's remember them all. First, be comfortable with yourself. Very important. If you're not comfortable, you're not going to actually take a picture of yourself. So I really encourage you just to try it. You're only going to get comfortable by doing it over and over. Next is just start shooting. Don't let fear get in your way. And try everything. Don't be afraid of what other people will think. Don't be afraid of what you might think when you see the final product. Just try it. See what comes out. Buy a remote. You could walk about 20 feet and get one. Very convenient. And get inspired. So you have a full list of photographers. If you wanted to see that link again, it's rmsp.com/self-portrait-artists. And there's a whole list of photographers who will inspire you. Thank you.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.